Chapter 5. Sport or Amateur Butchery. That particular form of recreation which is euphemistically known as sport has a close historical connection with the practice of flesh eating, inasmuch as the hunter was in old times what the butcher is now, the purveyor, on whom the family was dependent for its daily supply of victuals. Modern sport, however, as usually carried on in civilised European countries, has degenerated into what can be well described as amateur butchery, a system under which the slaughter of certain kinds of animals is practiced less as a necessity than as a means of amusement and diversion. Just as youthful nobles during the savage scenes and reprisals of the Huguenot Wars used to seize the opportunity of exercising their swordsmanship and perfecting themselves in the art of dealing graceful death blows, to the modern sportsman converts the killing of animals from a prosaic and perhaps distasteful business into an agreeable and gentlemanly pastime. Now, on the very face of it, this amateur butchery, in one sense, the most wanton and indefensible of all possible violations of the principle of animals' rights. If animals, or men for that matter, have the necessity to be killed, let them be killed accordingly. But to seek one's own amusement out in the death pangs of other beings, this is saddening stupidity indeed. Wisely did Wordsworth inculcate as the moral of his Heart Leap Well, never to blend our pleasure or our pride with sorrow of the meanest thing that feels. But the sporting instinct is due to sheer callousness and insensibility. The sportsman, by force of habit or by force of hereditary influence, cannot understand or sympathise with the sufferings he causes, and being, in the great majority of instances, a man of slow perception, he naturally finds it much easier to follow the hounds than to follow an argument. And here, in his chief blame, lies also his chief excuse, for it may be said to him, as it cannot be said of certain other tormentors, that he really does not comprehend the import of what he is doing. Whether this ultimately makes his position better or worse is a point for the casuist to decide. That it would have to be killed anyhow is a truly deplorable reason for torturing any animal whatsoever. It is an argument which would equally have justified the worst barbarities of the Roman amphitheatre. To exterminate wolves and other dangerous species may indeed at certain places and times be necessary and justifiable enough, but the sportsman nowadays will not even perform this practical service of exterminating such animals. The fox, for example, as are noxious to the general interest of the community. On the contrary, he preserves them, note the unintended humour of the term, and then, by a happy afterthought, claims the gratitude of the animals themselves for his humane and benevolent interposition. In plain words, he first undertakes to rid the country of a pest, and then, finding the process of an enjoyable one to himself, he contrives that it shall never be brought into a conclusion. Prometheus had precisely as much reason to be grateful to the vulture for eternally gnawing at his liver as have the hunted animals to thank the predacious sportsman who preserved them. Let me once more enter a protest against the Kantian Pharisaism, which is afraid to take the just responsibility of its own selfish pleasure-seeking. What name should we bestow, said a humane essayist of the 18th century, on a superior being who, without provocation or advantage, should continue from day to day, void of all pity and remorse, to torment mankind for diversion, and at the same time endeavour with the utmost care to preserve their lives and to propagate their species, in order to increase the number of victims devoted to his benevolence, and to be delighted in a proportion to the miseries which he occasioned. I say, what name detestable enough could we find for such a being? Yet, if we impartially consider the case and our immediate situation, we must acknowledge that, with regard to the inferior animals, just such a being is the sportsman. The excuses alleged in favour of English field sports in general, and of hunting in particular, are for the most part as irrelevant as they are unreasonable. It is often said that the manliness of our national character would be injuriously affected by the discontinuance of these sports, a strange argument when one considers the very unequal and therefore unmanly conditions of the strife. But apart from this consideration, what right can we possess to cultivate these personal qualities at the expense of unspeakable suffering to the lower races? Such actions may be pardonable in a savage or in a schoolboy in whom the savage nature still largely predominates, but they are wholly unworthy of a civilised and rational man. As for the nonsense sometimes talked about, the beneficial effect of those field sports which bring men into contact with the sublimities of nature, I will only repeat what I have elsewhere said on the subject. that the dynamiters who crossed the ocean to blow up an English town might on this principle justify the object of their journey by the assertion that the sea voyage brought them into contact with exalting and ennobling influence of the Atlantic. As the case stands between the sportsman and his victims, there cannot be much doubt as to where the benefits proceed, and from which party the gratitude is due. Woe to the ungrateful, says Michelet. By this phrase I mean the sporting crowd, who, unmindful of the numerous benefits we owe to animals, exterminate innocent life. A terrible sentence weighs on the tribes of sportsmen. They can create nothing. To originate no art, no industry, it is shocking and hideous thing to see a child partial to sport, to see women enjoying and admiring murder and encouraging her child. That delicate and sensitive woman would not give him a knife, but she gives him a gun. The sports of hunting and coursing are a brutality which could not be tolerated for a day in a state which possessed anything more than the mere name of justice, freedom and enlightenment. Nor can they comprehend, say Sir Thomas More of his model citizens in Utopia, the pleasure of seeing dogs run after a hare more than of seeing one dog run after another. For if the seeing them run is that which gives the pleasure, you have the same entertainment to the eye on both these occasions, since that is the same in both cases. But if the pleasure lies in seeing the hare killed and torn by the dogs, this ought rather to stir pity that the weak, harmless and fearful hare should be devoured by strong, fierce and cruel dogs. To be accurate, the zest of sport lies neither in the running nor the killing as such, but in the excitement caused by the fact that a life, someone else's life, is at stake, that the pursuer is matched in a fierce game of hazard against the pursued. The opinion has been expressed by one well qualified to speak with authority on the subject, that well-laid drags tracked by experts would test the mettle both of hounds and riders to hounds, but then a terrified, palpitating, fleeing life would not be struggling ahead, and so the idea is not pleasing to those who find pleasure in blood. The case is even worse when the quarry is to all intents and purposes domesticated, an animal wild by nature, but by force of circumstances and surroundings tame, such as the Ascot stags, the victims of royal sport, which is one of the last and least justifiable relics of the feudal barbarianism. I would here remark that there is urgent need that the laws which relate to the humane treatment of animals should be amended, or more wisely interpreted, on this particular point, so as to afford immediate protection to these domesticated stags, whose torture, under the name and sanction of the Crown and State, has been long condemned by the public conscience. Bear baiting and cockfighting have now been abolished by legal enactment, and it is high time that the equally demoralising sport of hunting of tame stags should be relegated to the same category. The same must be said of some sports which are practised by the English working man, rabbit coursing in particular, that half-holiday diversion which is so popular in many villages of the north. An attempt is often made by the apologists of amateur butchery to play off one class against another in the discussion of this question. They protest, on the one hand, against any such interference with aristocratic sport, on the plea that working men are no less addicted to such pastimes, and on the other hand, a cry is raised against the unfairness of restricting the amusements of the poor, while noble lords and ladies are permitted to hunt the carted stag with impunity. The obvious answer to these quibbling excuses is that all such barbarities, whether practised by rich or poor, are alike condemned by any conceivable principle of justice and humaneness, and further, this is a doubtful compliment to working men to suggest that they have nothing better to do in their spare hours than to torture defenceless rabbits. It was long ago remarked by Martin, the author of the famous Act of 1822, that such an argument indicates at bottom a contempt rather than regard for the working classes. It is as much as to say, poor creatures, let them alone, they have few amusements, let them enjoy them. Nothing can be more shocking than the treatment commonly accorded to rabbits, rats and other small animals on the plea that they are vermin, and therefore it is tacitly assumed outside the pale of humanity and justice. We have here another instance of the way in which the application of contemptuous name may aggravate and increase the actual tendency to barbarous ill usage. How many a demoralising spectacle, especially where the young are concerned, is witnessed when fun is made out of the death and torture of vermin. How horrible is the practice, apparently universal throughout all country districts, of setting steel traps along the ditches and hedgerows, in which the victims are frequently left to linger in an agony of pain and apprehension for hours or even days. If the lower races have any rights whatsoever, here surely is the flagrant and excusable outrage on such rights. yet there are no means of redressing these barbarities, because the laws, such as they are, which prohibit cruelty to animals, are not designed to take any cognizance of vermin. All of that has been said of hunting and coursing is applicable also, in a less degree perhaps, but on exactly the same principle, to the sports of shooting and fishing. It does not in the least matter, so far as the question of animals' rights is concerned, whether you run your victim to death with a pack of yelping hounds, or shoot him with a gun, or drag him from his native waters by a hook. The point at issue is simply whether man is justified in inflicting any form of death or suffering on the lower races for his mere amusement and caprice. There can be little doubt what answer must be given to this question. In concluding this chapter, let me quote a striking testimony to the wickedness and injustice of sport, as exhibited in one of the most refined and fashionable forms, the cult of the pheasant. For what it is, says Lady Florence Dixie, but the deliberate massacre in cold blood every year of thousands and tens of thousands of tame hand-reared birds who are literally driven into the jaws of death and mown down in a peculiar brutal manner. A perfect roar of guns fills the air, louder tap and yell the beaters. After the din can be heard the heart-rending cries of wounded hares and rabbits, some of which can be seen dragging themselves away, with both hind legs broken, or turning around and around in their agony before they die. And the pheasants, they are on every side, some rising, some dropping, some lying dead, but the greater majority fluttering on the ground wounded, some with both legs broken and a wing, some with both wings broken and a leg, others merely winged, running to hide, others mortally wounded, gasping out their last breath of life amidst the fiendish sounds which surround them. And this is called sport. Sport in every form and every kind is horrible, from the rich man's hare coursing to the poor man's rabbit coursing. All show the tiger that lives in our natures and which nothing but a higher civilization will eradicate.